The night sky is peppered with thousands of stars that we can see with the naked eye. And do you see that one? That one's mine. Hi, it's Ryan from Nights Around a Table. Here's how you play Astra. You and your friends play astronomers who are bringing famous constellations to life. You'll spend stardust to claim stars on constellation cards using your colored dry erase marker. When you color in the last star on a card, that constellation comes to life and gives you a special reusable power. And anyone else who claimed a star on that card gets some kind of benefit too. When you drill down to a certain card in the draw deck, that triggers the end of the game. Whichever player has earned the most points from a variety of sources wins the game as the world's most famous astronomer. You can play Astra with 2 to 5 players. Here it is set up for a 4-player game. You've got a journal that has your pouch full of stardust. Well, this is the stuff you'll spend to color in the stars. This is a cap on the amount of stardust you can replenish later in the game. But as you see, you can eventually mark off these circles to increase the amount of stardust your pouch can hold. If you get any telescope tokens, you store them here. They'll give you more flexibility and let you extend your turn when you color in stars. And the bottom of your journal tracks your wisdom. The more wisdom you have, the more constellations you'll be able to hold on to when you discover them. You also have a final scoring card that lets you earn points for the different constellation cards you collect. We'll look at that a little later. Off the top of your turn, you perform the ability phase, where you can activate your constellation cards to use their powers. But since this is the beginning of the game, you don't have any constellation cards, so we'll skip that bit and loop back around to it. After that, you move on to the actions phase. You have 2 options. You can either take 1 or more observe actions, or you can take a rest action. Resting is how you replenish your stardust supply and recharge your constellation's abilities. So it doesn't make any sense to do that right now either. So let's take an observe action and color in some stars. Observe action. When you observe, you get to pick one of the constellations in the middle of the table and color in one of the stars on it. Each constellation has a starting star. If you're the first player to color in a star on this card, you need to begin with that star. Each star you color in costs you 1 nugget of stardust from your pouch. After you color in 1 star on that card, you can color in another if you have more stardust to spend. But you have to color in a star that's connected to the star you just marked. Stars are considered connected when there's a white line between them. So this starting star is connected to these 2 stars. You could spend a second chunk of stardust to mark one or the other. But you couldn't jump all the way over here and mark this one because, well, that's more than 1 star away from the one you just colored in. So you can keep marking stars until you either run out of stardust to spend, or you decide you want to stop, or you reach a dead end where there are no more connected stars you can color in. That's your complete observe action finished. From that point, you can either end your turn, or you can spend a telescope token, if you have it, to take another observe action, which lets you keep marking 1 or more stars either on the constellation you were just marking, so you could, for example, jump over to this star and start marking from there, or you can jump to an entirely different constellation card and start marking stars on that one. Note that it's the spent telescope that allows you to do this. You can't bounce around to unconnected stars or entirely different constellation cards within the same observe action. You can keep spending telescopes to extend your turn, taking additional observe actions until you either decide to stop or you run out of telescopes and or stardust to spend. At the beginning of a star making sesh, if you start with a card that already has some stars marked on it, the first star you mark has to be connected to a star that's already been marked. It doesn't have to have been marked by you, but it could be. So in this example, you could start by marking this one or this one, but you couldn't start over here since that star isn't connected to one that someone has already marked. Each constellation is like a miniature maze, and by carefully choosing which stars to mark, you can head your opponents off at the pass. Certain stars are all sparkly. If you manage to mark one of these special grand stars, you increase your wisdom by coloring in the leftmost empty circle on your wisdom track. Increasing your wisdom lets you hang on to more constellation cards, which we'll talk about shortly. Discovery phase. You perform the discovery phase after either the ability or action phases. Well, that's when you check to see if you colored in the last star on 1 or more constellation cards. If you did, you have discovered that constellation, and you get to claim the card and put it beneath your journal, where it will give you some sort of special ability. But before you go hogging all the stars and naming them after yourself, you have to give credit to the other astronomers who helped you discover that constellation. Every player who isn't you, who marked at least one star on the constellation you're claiming, gets one of the prizes along the bottom of the card, which the game calls Boons. The player who marked the most stars gets to choose a boon first, and you cross off that boon so it's unavailable to the other contributors. Then the player who marked the next highest number of stars gets to choose a boon from the ones that remain. If two players who aren't you marked the same number of stars on a card, they'd choose a boon simultaneously. They can both pick the same boon if they want to, or they can each pick a different boon. Either way, cross off whatever boon gets picked. We'll see what the boons do in a sec. After dealing with one constellation, if you filled in any other constellations, you keep claiming those cards and letting contributing players choose their boons like the boon choosers they are. When you've claimed all of the constellations you've discovered, you have to figure out whether or not you can keep them. Your wisdom track limits the number of constellations you can hang on to. Let's say you discovered a third and a fourth constellation by the end of your turn, but your wisdom track isn't quite full enough to let you keep 4 cards. Sadly, you have to discard 2 of your constellation cards. You can get rid of the 2 you just discovered, or the 2 you already own, or a mix of both. Once your discovery phase ends, refill the empty slots around the sphere board with cards from the deck. Ability phase. Now that we've seen how you can discover constellations, let's loop back to the beginning of your turn, where you get to use your constellation's abilities. Here you are with 2 constellations you discovered on previous turns. Each card has an ability. Canis Minor lets you gain 1 wisdom, and Cetus lets you mark any star on an undiscovered constellation without spending any stardust. To use a constellation's ability, you tip it sideways like this. Once you've exhausted a constellation, you can't use its ability again until it gets refreshed, and we'll see how that happens in a bit. The constellations do all kinds of things for you, from gaining fame for every undiscovered card where you've marked a star, to getting you extra wisdom or telescope tokens. This one's a horsey, this one gives you a lupus, and this one makes you shake your booties. I don't know. There are 48 of them, so I'm not going to go over each one in detail, but they're all cool and interesting, and discovering them is part of the fun of the game. There are a couple of ways you can refresh your exhausted constellations. Let's look at one of them. Rest action. On your turn, instead of taking 1 or more observe actions, you can take a rest action. Resting lets you refill your pouch and reactivate your constellations. So first, look at the capacity of your pouch. It says 7 stardust, and you have 1 stardust. So you can take 6 more stardust to bring you up to your pouch limit of 7. This limit only matters when you refill your pouch by resting. If you get a boon or a special ability that knits you some stardust, you're allowed to go over your pouch limit. Then you get to refresh your exhausted constellations so that you can use their abilities again on a later turn. But there's a catch to which constellations you get to refresh. Each constellation is associated with a different element: earth, wind, and fire, and water. This token on the sphere board marks which element is active, and you can only refresh a constellation ability if its element matches that active element. So, because Earth is active, you could refresh your Canis Minor card, but your Cetus card is aligned to water, so it stays exhausted. Finally, the last step of your rest action is to move that token clockwise to the next element. If it crosses over this icon, you discard the top card of the draw pile, which brings you closer to reaching that trigger card and ending the game. Once you take a rest action, your turn is finished. You can't then spend telescopes to take observe actions, and likewise, you can't take 1 or more observe actions and then finish your turn with a rest. You either observe or rest on the actions phase of your turn. Boons. Now let's take a look at the boons you can claim on a constellation card that another player discovers but you contributed to by marking 1 or more stars on it. The boon of fame gets you the indicated number of fame points. These fame points are what you need to win the game, and you mark them along the outside of your journal. I recommend you start by circling them, so that if you do a full lap, you can start coloring them in to indicate you've gone around once. The boon of Stardust gets you the indicated number of Stardust lumps, and you can take them in excess of your pouch limit. The boon of Observation gets you a certain number of telescope tokens. The boon of Improvement lets you increase your pouch size by a certain amount so you can gain a higher number of Stardust wads whenever you take a rest action. The Boon of Wisdom lets you fill in wisdom circles so you can hang on to more constellations. And the Boon of Activation lets you refresh a certain number of constellation cards regardless of which element is active. Endgame. The draw deck has this special game-ending card that gets inserted at a different depth level at the beginning of the game, depending on your player count. If that card gets uncovered on the starting player's turn, everyone else gets one more turn and the game ends. If someone other than the starting player uncovers that card, everyone finishes a turn until you get back around to the starting player, and then everyone at the table gets one more turn before the game ends. Then it's time to score. First, you score as many points as your pouch capacity. Pouch capacity is 10? I'll get 10 points. Same with your wisdom. If the highest capacity you marked was 5, you get 5 points. Every 3 leftover Stardust clods get you a point. Every 2 stars you marked on undiscovered constellations around the sphere board get you a point. Each of your discovered constellation cards has a point value on it. If that constellation is active at the end of the game, you get that many points. Card is exhausted? No points for you. Finally, you were dealt one of these scoring cards off the top of the game. Some of the boxes are already filled in. For every constellation you collected that's tied to a certain element, you fill in a box in that element's row. It doesn't matter if the card is active or exhausted. You've got 2 water constellations, so you fill in the 2 leftmost empty boxes in the water row. When you're finished, you'll score a certain number of points in each row. 0, 2, 6, or 11 points if you filled in the whole row. And then a certain number of points for each column. If you filled in 3 boxes in a column, you get 3 points. And if you filled in an entire column, you get 6 points. Write all those scores down and sum them all up in this corner of the card, and then track those points along the edge of your journal. Whoever ends up with the most points wins the game as the most famous astronomer, joining the ranks of Galileo and Madame Zora. In the case of a tie, all tied players share in the victory. 2-player rules. There's a special set of rules if you want to try Astra with 2 players. Pick a marker that will represent a dummy player, which the game calls the Dreamer. If you take a rest phase, pay attention to the number on the wedge that you move the sphere marker into. That's how many stars you have to mark with the Dreamer pen. Which stars do you mark? Well, if any of the constellations have 0 marked stars, that's the card you choose. If there's a tie for unmarked stars, you pick the card with the most stars. And if there's still a tie, well, you get to choose which card to mark. Otherwise, if every card has at least 1 mark on it, go with the card that has the most stars on it. And if that's still a tie, well, you pick. Then mark a number of stars matching the number on the sphere board, following the usual rules for marking stars. Sometimes the Dreamer will finish a constellation card, in which case you and your opponent get to choose boons as usual, with the player who marked the most stars getting first choice. Then you discard the card. Maybe you claim a card that both your opponent and the Dreamer have contributed to. If the Dreamer has marked more stars than your opponent, you cross out the 2 leftmost boons on the card before your opponent gets to choose a boon. But if your opponent has more marked stars than the Dreamer, your opponent gets to choose from the full range of boons. Setup. To set up the game, lay down the sphere board that matches your player count. Shuffle the constellation cards and then count out a certain number of them. 29, 25, 18, or 11 for a 2, 3, 4, or 5 player game. And stick the game ending card on top of that stack. And knock it out a tick so that everyone can see it coming. Then place a certain number of cards on top of that. 19, 23, 30, or 37, depending on your player count. More players, more cards. At any point in the game, players are allowed to count how many cards are left until that game-ending card shows up, but you're not allowed to look at the faces of the cards themselves. Flip 1 card face up to start the discard pile, and the element on that card determines where the element marker starts. Fill in the spots around the sphere board with undiscovered constellation cards from the draw deck. Pile the Stardust clods and the telescope tokens nearby, and then give everyone a journal, a marker, and 8 globs of Stardust to start. Deal a final scoring card to each player, which should be kept secret until the end of the game. Whoever most recently saw a shooting star takes this token and remains the starting player for the entire game. Play begins with that player and continues around the table going clockwise. And now you're ready to play Astra. Did you just watch that whole thing? Oh, hey, to 100% this video, click the badge to subscribe, and then click the bell to get notifications when I've got new stuff.